Hi, hello, and welcome to week 7. Time for some character development and sequential art. For some of you, this may sound like exactly what you want to be doing in an illustration class, and for others of you, maybe a little bit of dread. But we're going to be spending about 6 weeks on these two projects that are coming up. The first being the character development project, the second being the sequential art project. And I think honestly, if you follow the process step by step, it won't seem quite so awful to you if it is something that scares you a bit. And for those of you that are into this kind of thing, it should be 6 weeks of glory and fun. So, without further ado, let's jump right into it. So, the first idea of character development is to know your character really, really well. You really just need to figure out what they look like when they're walking, when they're sitting down to eat, when they're doing whatever activity might fall into your future storylines. So you really just need to know exactly how their body moves at all times. You need to know exactly what their face does at all times. You need to let that character evolve with you and have feeling and emotion and really have a backstory, have a very luscious backstory. Um, you really just need to develop beyond what you initially see. It may not matter that nobody knows exactly where this character came from, but you do, and so you know how that person would think, or how that animal would think, or whatever. So the first example that I use when I'm thinking about people that really worked on their character for a long time and really got to know exactly what that character would do is Charles Schulz. I don't know if any of you pay attention to the comics section anymore. It seems kind of like it is a little bit played at this point. But the Peanuts were running in the comics for literally 50 years. Charles Schulz came from St. Paul and did so well with his comics that he ended up in California and had a huge house. And he really kind of epitomized what you can do in a career with just comics. And his characters, Charlie Brown, Lucy, Linus, the whole gang, all based on either him or people that he knew, interactions that he had as a child that he had trouble processing. He was kind of a terrible student actually, and the things that he liked to do were the projects where he was able to, draw as many different items in your house that you can think of, or um, working for his school newspaper and making some little comics there. But his characters are super iconic and very simple. And I would argue that the simpler your character, in some ways, the more difficult to actually, really define your character. We really need to get to that point where with just a couple lines we can get a character's expression, we can get their attitude and their backstory a little bit. We know that character. And Charles Schulz really did this with the Peanuts. Here's Snoopy. And we have a kind of a range of drawings of Snoopy here. I believe the one in the lower right was the first drawing of Snoopy ever. And he looks a little bit less defined maybe than in the one on the lower left. We we can recognize his attitudes and his feelings. Schulz uses his whole body to really kind of give us expression. It really seems to work. So here's a few more movements with Snoopy in them. Here's a Snoopy walk cycle, just because it's fun. So, on to Tex Avery. Tex Avery did some comics for Warner Brothers. He did some comics, or rather, excuse me, cartoons for Warner Brothers and for Hanna-Barbera. You'll recognize some of his work. So here we have a character sheet for Lucky Ducky. I'd like you to pay close attention to this character sheet because this is the kind of thing that I want you producing for me in 3 weeks. I want you to make character sheets. So thinking about different facial expressions, some different gestures with the body, and then, one or maybe two color images so that we can see how the body looks in color from that particular angle. Here we have one from Smellbound with a range of different characters in the movie. Here we have that awesome dog character with that weird laugh. Here we have another dog character. Bulldogs are really interesting because you'll see artists really get into bulldogs. They're already kind of shaped like a cartoon anyway, and so it's fun to see what different artists will do with bulldogs. They usually just try to make those back legs as tiny as possible and the jowls huge, and the front legs pretty big too. We have that sweet little penguin that's always freezing. Here we have a later Tex Avery drawing of a bulldog. So you notice like the rear end got even smaller and the front end got way bigger and the jowls got even bigger and he looks way goofier. Okay, so here we have a sketch from Ren and Stimpy. It's just the fish, and oh my, a simple drawing, but we really get the idea of this fish. It's awesome. So here's a few coming from comics, and I lead off with some quick drawings out of what is the title of the book? Excuse me. How to Draw Comics the Marvel Way, I believe is what it was called. It was a book I got when I was like 8. It's great. But it really kind of breaks down how to draw a gesture of a character so that, we're starting with just those simple line structures and then building rudimentary shapes around it and then slowly building up and into garments and not really just starting with garments or starting with facial expressions, really capturing the way a character stands. Then we move on. An entire lesson in that book was devoted to how to draw eyes and noses. And really, how are you going to approach those things? In the book, it says, don't draw them like the ones on the right. But I mean, frankly, you can draw them like the ones on the right. But if you do, then, your drawings need to be consistent with that one. So here's a range of characters out of comics, drawn in a more cartoony style, kind of like what is that, the Teen Titans cartoon, or something like that. Here we have another character, not quite so well known here. Here's a much simpler looking character. Still get an idea of what the character's all about, though. Also looks like this one was done digitally. Here's some rough flash drawings. Still get some idea of the very serious nature of this Flash. His body stances leave something to be desired a little bit, though. Here's a series of head drawings of a character from anime. Here are, I love these ones, some chubby versions of Logan and Captain America and Frank Castle. Gotta love the chubby versions. So it's fun to kind of re-envision characters like the what ifs. Here's from Johnny the Homicidal Maniac. I don't know if any of you know that, but it was pretty big when I was in the latter part of my high school years. And here's some Spider-Man ones. So sequential art, and herein, yes, we just talked about character development, and we're jumping forward and beginning our discussion about sequential art. There'll be a little bit more of a discussion of sequential art as we go along. However, I kind of want to just give you some basics right now to be thinking about while you're working on your character. So sequential art, also visual narrative, graphic narrative, pictorial narrative, sequential pictorial narrative, sequential storytelling. You get the idea. It's a narrative. We're telling a narrative in the form of comic strips, comic books and graphic novels, storyboards, webcomics, and the idea being we're telling the story in a chronological order. Sometimes we break that order, but we're still thinking about this happens and this happens and this happens. There's a visual component. There is a written component. So you first see some sequential artworks in some of the uh, Egyptian hieroglyphs. Um, so we get a story that's told from left to right, I think, top to bottom, and we have, their pictograms and pictures working back and forth to tell the story. Here's an early Colombian picture manuscript, similar idea, telling telling more of a history, but through pictures and sometimes pictograms. So this is considered to be one of the first comic strips that we know of. 17th. It's from the 17th century, and it told the happenings in a court. Here's The Day in the Life of King George IV by Charles Williams, also considered to be one of the earlier strips that told anything, told this narrative. Comic strips, however, the first newspaper comic strips appeared in North America in the late 19th century. We bring up the newspaper comic strips because that's really what we're thinking about when we're thinking about comics and graphic novels, etc. That's kind of where we're thinking that logic begins. So the Yellow Kid is usually credited as one of the first newspaper strips. If you look at the Yellow Kid, you can see just how much comic strips seem to have changed over time. So here we have The Boys Will Be Boys. Some simple drawings here. Gotta love the really yellowed paper that everything's been scanned in at. There's the loony literature. I really love the drawing in this one. That the grasshopper is just so good. I think it's a grasshopper. Here's some. You get a lot of the serial comics, so story that happens a little bit at a time. You don't see that quite so much anymore. I think they still run Prince Valiant, but I also don't know of anybody that actually reads Prince Valiant. Let me know in the boards if anybody actually reads Prince Valiant. That'd be interesting to find out. You get a lot of science fiction and mystery stories, that kind of thing. Pulp ideas in those sorts of projects. Good stuff. So, comic books. A comic book or comic book. I love that space or no space kind of thing here. Also called comic magazine or simply comic, is a publication that consists of comic art in the form of sequential juxtaposed panels that represent individual scenes. So, what on earth does that mean? So, it means images and words working together to tell the story through sequential scenes. So here was it: Superman to Captain Marvel, an early Spider-Man, actually the first Spider-Man, excuse me, some Batman. So you see we have our title like we're used to, and words, images, all working together, left to right, top to bottom. This is a fairly simple layout. They get way more complex, but you get the idea. You've seen this before. We have the death of Superman. This totally rocked so many people's worlds way back in the day, for me. But we also get some underground comics. So this is a comic done by R. Crumb during the late '60s, early '70s. The R. Crumb stuff, they get away. The underground comics let you get away with a little bit more provocative imagery and storytelling. And while there isn't quite the market for it that there is for maybe the mainstream comics, I think that depending on who the people are that are making it, they might actually see more money coming in than some of the people working at the big comic book companies. It is not an easy way to make a living. Um, Sorry to burst anybody's bubble if that's like what they really want to do, but you gotta really put in some hours in order to make some money doing comics, and they have such a quick turnaround on so much of their stuff. But we get the R. Crumb comics in particular. R. Crumb's kind of the preeminent underground comic artist to the point where he's probably not underground anymore. But he just made so many comics about such just what's the word? I guess we can just say provocative again, but it's just like you know subjects that should not be mentioned in printed work, and he was really pushed the envelope when it came to his comic work. And then we get to Chris Ware, and Chris Ware is really interesting because, first of all, the man is incredibly prolific. But while he was in college, he started drawing Quimby Mouse, and with Quimby Mouse, he really started to experiment with different formats in comics. And so he really pushed at that time the envelope in layout, and still does today. So his comics sometimes look more or less like a normal comic, but he's pushed his comics into some publication gigs that you wouldn't expect to see comics in. His work gets very serious. Here we have a couple covers for the New Yorker that he did. So graphic novels also, as we start to talk about getting serious, graphic novels also allow people to be very serious. The format is very different than a serial comic, which we expect people to buy every month. And so, artists will tell a long story that, has some more adult themes in it often, and uses that picture and word combo to really strengthen the concepts within the art. So here's a few examples: Blankets, Palestine by Joe Sacco, super intense, and Persepolis, also super intense. Although you look at the artwork in Persepolis, and while it's really intense, it's also like cartoony enough that like you're able to kind of process this really heavy genocidal theme in a little bit more of a casual manner, if you want to call it that. Well, it sounds kind of terrible. So here we get Ghost World, which is a Daniel Clowes comic. Also some very serious subjects. I really love the way Daniel Clowes does his titles and his like single color washes. His drawings aren't the most dynamic. His work being very much social interactions versus, somebody doing something death-defying and heroic. Here we get some Harvey Pekar. Harvey Pekar, very, very similar to Daniel Clowes in that it's mostly about social interactions, very adult themes. His more famous work being for like American Splendor. He did a autobiographical work called The Quitter. Just really, really great stuff. Really strong and really complex storylines, and they feel just very adult and relatable. Here we have Adrian Tomeline, this Canadian artist working for Drawn and Quarterly. This is Killing and Dying, which made it to the New York Times bestseller list. Was it last year or the year before? But just another person that does some really, really heavy subjects and kind of makes them feel a little bit easier to digest based on the way he's drawing. So in Killing and Dying, it's a range of short comics that aren't necessarily related, about very simple subjects. We have a couple different comics about some relationship stuff. They feel a little bit heavier. So, on to just a little bit of a talk about storyboards. So, we know that within design and marketing, people have you do storyboards to kind of develop, a plan to implement, or a flow chart, to tell the way a process within a company works, or in the case of a business, rather, excuse me, in case of a film, you'll have people do storyboards so that you know what shots are happening, in what order, and how that is going to go down. You know where the angles are, etc. So storyboards are a really important sequential piece. They have their own sort of language to them that's a little bit different than comics, but they're still read in sequential order. So you get the big arrows to tell you where the movement is, the arrows in between frames that tell you if you're panning into or out of, etc. Um, so an entirely different language too. Some of them are very, very simple. Some of them, like the ones for Disney, end up getting really, really complex and kind of beautiful. And you're looking at them and you're like, well, that's almost the animated film already. Um, so that's another space where you'll see sequential artwork. Webcomics. Webcomics gets its own own spot because it's still a serialized thing, but it's very much a DIY serialized thing. You know, people get a web space or hosting for very cheap, and then it's just them and their comic or their computer, putting together a weekly or a monthly bit to share with an audience that they hopefully grow. So here's some work by Diana Knock, who has discontinued this comic, I believe, but her work was just beautiful, and she's doing these weekly pieces that they were just so good. But like the underground comics, you can get some much more complicated and adult themes in these, without having to worry about going through a publisher who may or may not like what you've done. You're publishing everything yourself, so it's okay. Um, Now, when you go to share that, maybe on social media, then you might get some sort of boot, if it's too adult. But you also see a lot more simple drawings, and you notice, this slide tells just as easy of a story as this slide. They're very different quality in drawing, and so they feel different, but maybe there's something cute and whimsical about this drawing that isn't present in the more flashy drawing previously. Same here. So you get much more freedom to really just draw the way you want to draw. You can really focus on the story rather on the characters. And I really, when you're doing your character designs, I want you to really kind of think about these. If you're a person that's not super confident in your drawing skills, like look at this character here. He's essentially just an oval with some weird like finger shaped ovals, like half loaves of bread on his head for hair, and then like stick figure arms and legs. The chickens are just smaller stick figures. So I mean, you can communicate a lot without having to get too awfully complicated in drawing. You certainly can get more complicated with your drawing, but this also is very stylized. But it still tells the story, and that's what we're concerned with. So when you're designing your characters, when you're thinking about your characters, I want you to think about what visual elements you can break your characters down into. Can I make this body out of a square, a rectangle? Does it have to be a circle? Think about these shapes that you can recreate so that you can move on to another gesture and be like, okay, cool. Well, I got to do my starting circle, and how am I moving my limbs around this? And it becomes much more simple. Just break it down step by step. So here we have a couple more webcomic drawings. Again, very, very simple and very silly. And here we have the oatmeal. The oatmeal is great. Oatmeal's drawings are so simple, so good. And his comics are pretty long usually, with really ludicrous subjects. Um, so check out the oatmeal if you don't know the oatmeal. Uh, Particularly the one about the cat. The cat's so good. Okay, so here is your project 3, which, like I said, is related to project 4, in that you're creating a character for project 3, and then you'll be using that character in project 4 to tell an origin story of that character. So, make sure that whatever you do for this character project is something that you feel good about and attached to, because you're going to spend roughly 6 weeks on the project. So, um, over the course of the next 3 weeks, I would like you to prepare a character design, which will culminate in 2 color character sheets, like the slides of model sheet number 20 and Lucky Ducky. These should feature a range of different poses and facial expressions. The character must be selected from Jean-Louis Borges' Book of Imaginary Beings. Now, I don't expect you all to run out and buy that book. I don't even expect you to go to the library and get out that book. If you go to the Wikipedia page for Jean-Louis Borges' Book of Imaginary Beings, the link is right there, or literally if you type in Borges Book of Imaginary Beings, it's the first hit on Google. So that lists all the characters in the book. It gives a brief description of the characters in the book. The Borges description of them is more fun if you care to get into it. Maybe pick out a character from the list and then go look up the Borges so that you can read the more in-depth one for that character. They're all like 2 paragraphs long at the most. But anyway, I'd like you to select a character from his list of imaginary beings. In the first week, I expect you to pick a character or 2 that resonate with you. Find some reference images and begin your process of sketching out what this character looks like. Think about textures. Think about body shapes. If this is a bird, maybe you want to be thinking about what do the feathers look like. If it's a bird with like reptilian scales, like how do I differentiate between these two textures? Especially if you're like doing simple drawings. Okay, how does this look different? So your sketches can be as complex as here's my initial idea for this whole character, but also here's my idea for how I'm going to approach differences in scales and feathers or facial features, etc. So the second week, I would like to see you figuring out the details of your character. So unlike the previous assignments, you're not going to be working on your character sheets necessarily for week 2. You're certainly welcome to be starting to do so, but I really just want you to see you have more refined sketches in your sketchbooks of these characters. So, bring those different textures into your character. If it had feathers and scales, for instance, here's that character with those two textures, and this is how the character kind of looks like when we put it together. Maybe do 2 or 3 different finalized poses that you feel like this is what it'll look like. Maybe a couple heads to give us an idea of what the expression would look like on the head. And some of these characters are really wild too. Like there's a character that has an axe for a head. So like, how can you make that head have emotion? How can you give it like facial features possibly? Just like have fun with it, please. Just like be crazy, be wacky. I gave this project specifically so that you could be wacky and you didn't have to think too hard about coming up with the character. It's already wacky for you. And then the third week, I'd like you to have your final character sheets done. So again, this should look like the model sheet number 20 or the Lucky Ducky. Just that range of different facial expressions, a couple bodies, and a couple full colored bodies. Write the name of the character in the center of the sheet, and your artist name in the middle of the sheet, and just a couple different sheets. One should probably focus on different body movements, and the other on facial expressions. That's how I would do it. but you're welcome to break that down however you would like to. So by all means, get back to me with any questions that you may have. But for now, please get into this assignment and check out the worst job that I've ever had project, which will be due next week. It's just an exercise. Please make it as simple as you would like. I would totally go oatmeal or that weird flying unicorn piece style. Just something simple and quick, and really be thinking about how to tell a story from panel to panel as easily as possible. Okay, thanks, folks.